Before America had a name, 1000 to 1607. Long before the word America existed, the land already breathed with life. Forests stretched endlessly, rivers moved like living veins. From the icy plains of the north to the fertile valleys of the south, millions of indigenous people lived on this land, not as conquerors, but as caretakers. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy governed through councils and balance. The Mississippian cultures built cities larger than London at the time. The Pueblo peoples shaped homes from stone and earth that still stand today. They had laws, trade networks, spiritual systems. They did not call this land new. To them, it was home. Then, far across the ocean, something shifted. Europe was choking on its own ambitions. Kings wanted gold, churches wanted souls, empires wanted expansion, and sailors, desperate, ambitious, reckless sailors, wanted escape. In 1492, Christopher Columbus did not discover America. He collided with it. What followed was not exploration, it was catastrophe. Diseases invisible to the eye, smallpox, measles, influenza, spread faster than any army. Entire villages disappeared in silence. By the time Europeans began settling seriously, millions were already dead, long before a single musket was raised. The land seemed empty. It was not. It was haunted. The English arrived late and desperate. By the early 1600s, Spain dominated the Americas with silver and blood. France explored cautiously. England, however, was failing. Too many poor, too many prisons, too little land. So England gambled. In 1607, 3 ships reached the Chesapeake Bay and established Jamestown. They were not farmers, they were gentlemen, gold seekers, and survivors of nothing. They expected riches. Instead, they found hunger. The land was swampy, water was poisoned, mosquitoes carried death. By winter, starvation consumed them. Some dug up corpses to eat. Others vanished into the woods, never seen again. Jamestown survived not because of English strength, but because of native mercy. Powhatan tribes traded food, and a young woman named Pocahontas became a bridge between worlds. History turned her into a myth. Reality was harsher. She was later captured, converted, renamed, paraded through England, and died at 21. America's story would repeat this pattern endlessly. Survival built on someone else's loss. Faith, Fire, and the First American Divisions, 1620 to 1700. In November of 1620, a small, battered ship named the Mayflower drifted through the gray Atlantic and finally dropped anchor near a rocky, unforgiving shore. The passengers were not heroes. They were afraid. Men, women, and children huddled below deck, sick from months at sea, unsure whether the land ahead meant salvation or death. They were not searching for adventure. They were fleeing something far more powerful, control. They called themselves pilgrims. In England, their faith had made them criminals. They believed that the Church of England was corrupt, too close to kings, too distant from God. For this belief, they were fined, jailed, hunted. So they ran, not to build a new nation, not to invent freedom, but to worship without interference. When they stepped onto the cold soil of New England, they signed a short agreement, the Mayflower Compact. It was not revolutionary, but it was profound. Ordinary people agreeing to govern themselves. They did not know it yet, but this fragile promise would echo through centuries. Their first winter was merciless. Half of them died. Frozen ground refused crops, hunger weakened bodies, disease finished the rest. Graves were hidden to prevent native tribes from seeing how few remained alive. Again, survival came not from European strength, but native aid. The Wampanoag taught them how to plant corn, fish the rivers, survive the land. And for one brief moment in history, two worlds sat together. They shared a meal. They prayed to different gods. They trusted just enough. History would later call this Thanksgiving, but trust in America never lasted long. The Puritan dream and its dark shadow. Within a decade, far larger ships arrived. The Puritans were not refugees, they were missionaries. They came with families, supplies, certainty, and power. Their leader, John Winthrop, spoke of a city upon a hill, a society so righteous the world would watch and learn. But perfection demands obedience. Puritan New England became a land of strict laws, public punishments, and religious conformity. Church attendance was mandatory, dissent was dangerous. Freedom for them did not mean freedom for all. Those who challenged authority were banished or silenced. Roger Williams was expelled for preaching religious tolerance. He fled into the wilderness and founded Rhode Island, where belief was free and church and state were separated for the first time in American history. Anne Hutchinson dared to teach theology as a woman. She was labeled dangerous, exiled, and later killed in a native attack, an irony lost on her judges. America's contradiction deepened. A land founded by those fleeing oppression who quickly learned how to oppress. Fire in the forest. As English settlements expanded, native patience thinned. Land agreements were misunderstood or deliberately twisted. Forests fell, game vanished, diseases returned again and again. In 1637, fear turned to blood. The Pequot War exploded without warning. English militias surrounded a Pequot village at night and set it on fire. Men, women, and children burned or were shot as they fled. An English officer later wrote that the smell of burning bodies was sweet. This was not war, this was extermination. The survivors were sold into slavery. The message was clear: this land would not be shared. From that moment forward, America's expansion would follow a brutal pattern: treaty, betrayal, violence, justification. And always, the winners would write the history. The South grows rich and cruel. While New England prayed and punished, the Southern colonies chased profit. Tobacco fields stretched endlessly, rice plantations swallowed wetlands, wealth poured upward. But labor came at a cost. Indentured servants worked to death. When that supply failed, planters turned fully towards African slavery. Men and women were stolen from their homes, shipped in chains, sold like tools. Their names erased, their families shattered, their humanity denied. Colonial laws hardened skin color into destiny. A white servant could eventually be free, a black slave could not. America did not stumble into slavery. It built it carefully, law by law. And yet, even here, resistance never died. Slaves ran, they rebelled, they remembered who they were. Their survival was its own revolution. Seeds of an identity. By the late 1600s, the colonies no longer felt entirely English. They governed themselves, they fought their own wars, they adapted to a land that demanded independence of spirit. Distance from the crown created something dangerous: confidence. Colonists began to believe they could survive without kings. They were wrong, but they were learning. Slowly, painfully, the idea formed that power might come not from bloodlines, but from people. That idea would soon collide with empire,
and when it did, the world would never be the same.
When an empire tightened its grip, 1700 to 1763. By the dawn of the 18th century, the American colonies were no longer fragile experiments clinging to survival. They were growing, they were prosperous, and most dangerously of all, they were confident. Children born in Massachusetts or Virginia now called themselves something new. Not Englishmen living abroad, not temporary settlers, but colonists, people of the land. They farmed differently, prayed differently, governed themselves in town halls and assemblies. When trouble came, they raised militias instead of waiting for royal armies. For decades, Britain barely noticed. As long as trade flowed and loyalty was declared, the empire looked away. This neglect, later called salutary neglect, allowed colonial independence to grow unnoticed. But empires never ignore profit forever. The world catches fire. Europe was locked in endless conflict. Dynasties fought over thrones, borders, and pride. These wars spilled across oceans and continents. North America became a chessboard. Colonists called it the French and Indian War. Europeans called it the 7 Years' War. To native nations, it was yet another catastrophe forced upon their land. French forts crept down from Canada. British settlements pushed westward. Native tribes were caught between alliances that promised survival and delivered destruction. Young colonial men, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, picked up muskets and marched beside British redcoats. Among them was a tall Virginian officer named George Washington. He was inexperienced, ambitious, and hungry for honor. His early mistakes ignited global war. By the time the fighting ended in 1763, Britain had won the largest empire on earth, but victory came with a terrifying cost. Victory's poisoned gift. Britain was drowning in debt. Armies had to be paid, forts had to be manned, new lands had to be controlled, and Parliament looked west to the colonies. For the first time, Britain demanded something more than loyalty. It demanded money. New taxes appeared like storms: sugar, stamps, paper, trade restrictions. Colonists protested, not because they hated taxes, but because they had no voice. No taxation without representation, they cried. To them, this was not rebellion, it was a plea for fairness. To Britain, it sounded like ingratitude. The line that changed everything. In 1763, Britain drew a line across the map. The Proclamation Line forbade settlers from moving west into native lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains. It was meant to prevent war. Colonists saw betrayal. They had fought, they had bled, they had earned the land. Speculators ignored the line. Settlers crossed anyway. Violence followed. The empire's grip tightened. Troops were stationed in cities. Homes were searched. Liberty felt suddenly fragile. The colonists who once begged for protection now feared it. Ideas become dangerous. At the same time, something far more powerful than armies was spreading: ideas. European Enlightenment thinkers spoke of natural rights, social contracts, and the right of people to overthrow unjust rulers. Pamphlets crossed oceans, words ignited minds. Men gathered in taverns, churches, and homes to argue not about taxes, but about power. Who had the right to rule, and why? The answers frightened kings. Blood in the snow. On a cold night in 1770, British soldiers faced an angry crowd in Boston.
Insults flew, snowballs turned to stones, a musket fired, then another. 5 colonists fell dead. The event was small, the impact was massive. It was called the Boston Massacre, and it proved something terrible and true. Once blood is spilt, trust never fully returns. The calm before the storm. By the early 1770s, America stood at a crossroads. Most colonists still wanted peace. Most still considered themselves loyal subjects. But loyalty was cracking. Britain answered resistance with punishment. Colonists answered punishment with unity. Boycotts, committees, secret meetings. The empire tightened its fist. The colonies clenched theirs. And somewhere in the countryside of Massachusetts, muskets were being cleaned, powder was being stored, and ordinary men prepared for an extraordinary moment. The storm was coming, and once it broke, there would be no turning back.
The shot that shattered an empire, 1763 to 1776. The British believed fear would restore obedience. Instead, it forged rebellion. In Boston, tension became a constant presence, thick, suffocating, unavoidable. Red-coated soldiers patrolled narrow streets. Colonists watched from windows, fists clenched, teeth grinding. Then came the tea. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, attempting to save the failing East India Company. To Britain, it was economic logic. To the colonies, it was another reminder of power without consent. On a cold December night, men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships in Boston Harbor. They did not steal. They did not vandalize. They did not harm a soul. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the black water. Silence followed, then fury. Britain answered not with compromise, but with punishment. The intolerable response. Boston's port was shut down. Self-government was stripped away. Troops flooded the city. These laws were meant to isolate Massachusetts. Instead, they united the colonies. For the first time, men from Virginia to New Hampshire spoke not as separate colonies, but as one people. The First Continental Congress met in defiance. They did not yet declare independence, but they prepared for war. Militias trained quietly, weapons were hidden, signals were arranged, and Britain watched, too confident to stop it. The night the ride began. On April 18, 1775, British officers received orders. March to Concord, seize colonial weapons, crush resistance before it spread. They moved at night, but so did the resistance. Paul Revere rode through the darkness, pounding on doors, shouting warnings that echoed into legend. The British are coming. Men woke. Fathers kissed sleeping children. Farmers grabbed muskets. By dawn, 2 forces stood facing each other on Lexington Green. No one knows who fired first. History only remembers the result. The world holds its breath. 8 colonists lay dead. The British marched on, then were ambushed on the road back. Farmers fired from behind stone walls. Militiamen melted into forests. Redcoats fell by the dozens. The empire had been challenged by civilians, and the empire bled. Word spread faster than armies ever could. This was no riot. This was war. A nation in waiting. The Second Continental Congress gathered under the shadow of violence. They needed unity. They needed leadership. They needed time. They chose George Washington as commander. He was tall, quiet, respected. He did not promise victory. He promised endurance. As armies formed, ideas hardened. Some still hoped for reconciliation. Others knew the truth. There was no way back. The pen that declared a people.
In 1776, a thin pamphlet exploded across the colonies. Common Sense by Thomas Paine spoke plainly, brutally. Kings were not divine. Obedience was not destiny. Freedom was natural. Thousands read it. Thousands more listened. The impossible became inevitable. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. It spoke of equality and rights, words that would haunt the nation it created. Because even as it was signed, slavery endured. Native lands were seized. Women were excluded. America was born imperfect, but it was born defiant. The long war begins. Independence did not bring peace. It brought war on a scale few imagined. Britain was powerful, experienced, relentless. The colonies were divided, poor, untrained. Victory would not come quickly. It would come through sacrifice, suffering, and faith in something that did not yet exist, a nation. And the river they would soon cross would freeze in history forever.
Winter, blood, and the price of independence. 1776 to 1781. Independence was declared in summer. By winter, it nearly died. The Continental Army was not an army in the way Britain understood armies. It was a collection of farmers, laborers, former servants, immigrants, men bound more by belief than by training. They lacked uniforms, they lacked food, they lacked pay. What they did not lack was suffering. By late 1776, British forces had crushed Washington's troops across New York. Defeat followed defeat. Men deserted. Congress fled Philadelphia. The revolution looked like a mistake. Washington knew it. If nothing changed, the war would end before it truly began. The River of Desperation. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington made a decision that bordered on madness. Cross the ice-choked Delaware River. Attack hardened Hessian mercenaries. Do it in a storm. Failure meant annihilation. Success meant hope. Men crossed in silence, boats grinding against ice. Wind tore through coats. Some soldiers wrapped their bleeding feet in rags. At dawn, they attacked. The victory at Trenton was small in numbers, but massive in meaning. The army lived. The idea lived. America breathed again. War without mercy. The years that followed were brutal. Battles were won. Battles were lost. No victory was final. At Valley Forge, winter returned like a curse. Men froze, starved, died of disease. Washington refused to abandon them. Prussian officer Baron von Steuben trained the troops with iron discipline. Slowly, painfully, an army was forged, not perfect, but resilient. The world enters the fight. Britain's enemies watched carefully. France, humiliated in earlier wars, saw opportunity. In 1778, France entered the war, not out of love for liberty, but hatred for Britain. Money flowed, weapons arrived, navies clashed. The American Revolution became a global war. The war turns south. Britain changed strategy. If they could not crush the rebellion in the north, they would break it in the south, where slavery divided loyalties and loyalists were stronger. The fighting grew vicious. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Homes burned. Families fled. Freedom, it turned out, was not gentle. Yorktown, the end that didn't feel like one. In 1781, British General Cornwallis entrenched at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington saw his chance. With French troops and naval support, he moved swiftly.
The siege was relentless. When Cornwallis surrendered, it stunned the world. The empire had lost to colonies. But victory did not feel triumphant. The land was ruined. The treasury was empty. The future was uncertain. The war was over. The experiment had just begun. A dangerous question. Winning independence was one thing. Keeping it was another. What would America become? A new tyranny? A fragile alliance? Or something unseen in history? The answer would not come easily, because freedom, once won, demands structure, and structure demands sacrifice. Freedom without a foundation, 1781 to 1787. The cannons fell silent. Men returned to farms that no longer felt familiar. Cities bore scars. Families searched for those who never came home. Independence had been won, but America now faced a problem far more dangerous than British armies. It had no idea how to govern itself. The revolutionaries had feared tyranny so deeply that they created a government too weak to rule. The Articles of Confederation bound 13 states together like loose threads, connected but fragile. Congress could not tax. It could not enforce laws. It could not control trade. States argued like rivals instead of partners. Each printed its own money. Each guarded its sovereignty like a jealous secret. The unity of war dissolved into the confusion of peace. And ordinary people paid the price. The revolt that terrified the victors. In Massachusetts, farmers who had fought for independence now faced foreclosure, debt, and prison. They asked for relief. They were ignored. So they rose. Led by a former Continental Army officer named Daniel Shays, armed farmers shut down courts and marched in protest. This was not a rebellion against Britain. It was a rebellion against the new American elite. The uprising was crushed, but the fear it ignited spread faster than any musket fire. If the government could not protect property, control unrest, or ensure stability, then freedom itself was at risk. The revolution might devour its own children. A secret meeting. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they were there to revise the Articles. In reality, they planned to replace them entirely. The doors were shut, the windows sealed, guards stood watch. What emerged would shape centuries. Arguments erupted immediately. Large states wanted representation by population. Small states demanded equality. Northern states questioned slavery. Southern states threatened to walk away. The ideals of liberty collided with the realities of power. Compromise followed compromise, each one leaving scars. Slavery was counted, but only partially. The people would choose representatives, but not directly. Power would be divided, checked, restrained. No one was fully satisfied. That was the point. The Constitution is born. The United States Constitution was not a document of perfection. It was a document of survival. It assumed conflict. It anticipated ambition. It distrusted human nature. 3 branches were created to limit one another. Authority was split between federal and state power. Change was made possible, but difficult. When the delegates signed it, they were not celebrating. They were gambling. Would this new structure hold or collapse under its own contradictions? The argument that defined a nation. Ratification ignited the first great American debate. Federalists believed a strong central government was necessary to survive. Anti-Federalists feared another tyranny dressed in new clothes. Newspapers overflowed with essays, warnings, and promises. To calm fears, a compromise was reached. The Bill of Rights would be added, 10 amendments protecting speech, religion, due process, and the limits of power. Freedom would not depend on trust, it would be written. The Reluctant President. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected president. He did not want the job. He understood power too well to desire it. His presence alone steadied the nation. Every action set precedent. Every decision echoed forward. Would America become a monarchy or something radically new? Washington chose restraint, and in doing so, taught the nation how power should be handled. But beneath the calm, forces were already gathering. Disagreements over money, foreign alliances, and authority hardened into factions. Political parties, something the founders feared, were forming. The experiment was alive, and experiments can fail.
A young nation learns the cost of power. 1789 to 1820. George Washington knew that the greatest danger to the new republic would not come from foreign armies, but from division within. He watched it happen anyway. Almost immediately, two visions for America began pulling the nation apart. Alexander Hamilton believed in strength, banks, industry, centralized authority, and close ties with Britain. Thomas Jefferson feared that same power. He dreamed of farmers, local control, and sympathy for revolutionary France. They were both patriots. They were both right, and they were both wrong. Political parties formed despite desperate warnings against them. Newspapers turned vicious. Accusations of treason became common. The young republic discovered that freedom of speech included the freedom to attack. Democracy was loud and messy. Power changes hands. When Washington stepped down after 2 terms, the world held its breath. No king had died. No coup occurred. Power transferred peacefully. That moment mattered more than any battle. John Adams followed, inheriting foreign tension and domestic unrest. Laws meant to silence criticism backfired, igniting outrage. Voters responded not with rebellion, but ballots. Thomas Jefferson became president. The republic had survived its first true test. A deal with destiny. In 1803, Jefferson faced a choice that contradicted his beliefs. France offered to sell Louisiana. The price was high. The land was vast. The Constitution said nothing about such a purchase. Jefferson hesitated, then acted. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the nation and ensured its future. It also unleashed a force no one could fully control: westward expansion. The land hungers for people. Americans moved west with wagons, axes, and ambition. Forests fell, rivers were crossed, native treaties were broken as quickly as they were signed. Expansion was called destiny. To those already living there, it was invasion. Conflicts erupted endlessly. Each victory pushed the frontier further. Each defeat fueled bitterness. The republic grew stronger. Its conscience grew weaker. Slavery tightens its grip. With each new territory came the same poisonous question: free or slave? The nation pretended compromise could delay conflict forever. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise drew an artificial line across the map: half free, half slave. It bought peace at the cost of truth. Because slavery was no longer a regional issue, it was a national one. War proves survival. In 1812, America fought Britain again. Poorly prepared, deeply divided,
barely unified. The capital burned, the flag survived, the nation endured. Victory was uncertain, but survival was undeniable. The United States was no longer an experiment waiting to fail. It was a force, imperfect, ambitious, and expanding fast. But expansion demands reckoning, and the reckoning was coming.
Democracy's Dark Reflection, 1820 to 1848. By the 1820s, America had begun to believe in itself. The Revolution was history. The Constitution was settled. The nation had survived war, debt, and doubt. Ordinary white men, once excluded from power, now voted in unprecedented numbers. This was called progress, and in many ways it was. But every expansion of freedom carried a shadow, because democracy was widening for some, while vanishing entirely for others. The rise of a dangerous hero. Andrew Jackson was not refined. He was not cautious. He was not merciful. He was popular. Born poor, hardened by war, and fueled by rage against elites, Jackson became the symbol of the common man. His supporters saw him as proof that America no longer belonged to aristocrats. When he won the presidency, crowds flooded Washington. Furniture was smashed. Order collapsed. The people had arrived, and Jackson believed he was the people. Power without restraint. Jackson distrusted institutions. He vetoed laws, defied courts, destroyed the national bank. When the Supreme Court ruled in favor of native sovereignty, Jackson ignored it. The law, he believed, bent to the will of the majority. That belief would prove deadly. The trail written in blood. Southeastern native nations had adapted to American demands. They farmed, printed newspapers, wrote constitutions, appealed to courts. It did not save them. Gold was discovered on Cherokee land. White settlers demanded removal. Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. The result was not relocation. It was death. Families were forced west at gunpoint. Children froze. Elders collapsed. Graves lined the trails. The Cherokee called it Nuna Dal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. America called it policy. Expansion consumes the map. As native nations were pushed aside, settlers surged forward. Texas broke away from Mexico. War followed. Territory was taken. The nation stretched from ocean to ocean. Maps grew. Moral clarity shrank. Slavery followed the frontier relentlessly. Cotton ruled the South. Human lives were measured in profit. Abolitionists spoke louder. Slaveholders grew angrier. Compromise grew thinner. The country stood balanced on a blade. A house divided begins to crack. By the late 1840s, Americans argued less about whether slavery was right and more about whether it would spread. Violence erupted in Congress itself. New parties formed. Old alliances shattered. The nation expanded faster than its values could keep up. Every mile west pulled the country closer to a single unavoidable question. Can a nation founded on liberty survive half enslaved? The answer would not come peacefully. It never does. The Union breaks, 1848 to 1861. By mid-century, the United States had become a nation addicted to postponement. Every crisis was met with compromise. Every moral reckoning was delayed. Every wound was covered, never healed.
Slavery was the poison everyone tasted, and no one agreed how to remove. New territories demanded answers. Each answer created fury. Laws were written to preserve balance, but balance itself had become impossible. The nation was no longer arguing, it was threatening. The law that turned neighbors into hunters. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. It forced citizens of free states to assist in capturing escaped slaves. Judges were paid more to return human beings to bondage than to set them free. America's laws now demanded participation in injustice. Northern communities resisted. Southern leaders hardened. Trust collapsed. Blood on the plains. Kansas became a battlefield. Pro-slavery forces and abolitionists poured in, each determined to claim the territory. Towns burned, men were murdered in the night. This was not debate. This was civil war in miniature. The man who forced the question. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that Black Americans could never be citizens. The Dred Scott decision stripped hope from millions and exposed the emptiness of compromise. The law had chosen a side. So did a man named Abraham Lincoln. He did not call for immediate abolition. He called slavery wrong. That alone was enough. Fear becomes secession. When Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, Southern leaders did not wait. They left. One by one, states seceded, convinced that the Union threatened their way of life. They formed a new nation built explicitly on slavery. War was no longer theoretical. The first shots. In April 1861, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter. No one died that day, but the nation did. Families split. Neighbors chose sides. Hope was replaced with grief before the war had truly begun. The question that haunted the Republic since its birth now demanded an answer, not with words, but with blood. A nation baptized in blood, 1861 to 1865. When the war began, both sides believed it would be brief. Young men marched with music and flags. Families waved from porches. Politicians promised glory. They were wrong. The Civil War would become the deadliest conflict in American history. More Americans would die than in all other wars combined, and nothing would ever be the same again. Brothers against brothers. The first major battle at Bull Run shattered illusions. Soldiers panicked, lines collapsed, civilians fled. The war would not be romantic. It would be industrial. Railroads moved armies. Factories fed slaughter. Rifled muskets turned open fields into killing zones. Medical knowledge lagged behind destruction. Infection killed more than bullets. Amputation became routine. Suffering became normal. Lincoln learns the weight of power. Abraham Lincoln entered the presidency untested by war. He learned quickly. Generals failed him. Advisors doubted him. Newspapers mocked him. Mothers wrote letters begging for sons' lives. He read them all. The Union fought first to preserve itself, not to end slavery. But war has a way of stripping away lies. As enslaved people fled to Union lines by the thousands, the question could no longer be avoided. What was the war for? Freedom declared at a cost. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all slaves immediately, but it changed the war's soul. Freedom became a weapon, and a promise. Black soldiers joined the fight. Many were paid less, treated worse, killed if captured. They fought anyway, because the war was no longer just about union, it was about humanity. Hell has a name: Gettysburg. 3 days of chaos, smoke, screams, courage. Men charged into cannon fire knowing they would die. Fields became graves. When it ended, the Union held, but at an unimaginable cost. Lincoln later stood among the dead and spoke quietly. He did not promise glory, he promised meaning. The war's brutal end. By 1865, the South was exhausted. Cities burned, civilians starved, hope collapsed. General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox. There were no cheers, only silence. The Union was preserved, slavery was destroyed, but peace was fragile. And then violence struck again. The death that changed everything. Days after victory, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The nation mourned. The man who had held the Union together through patience and pain was gone, and with him the chance for a gentler healing. The war was over. The struggle for justice was not.
Reconstruction, Freedom and Betrayal, 1865 to 1877. The war had ended, but America was not healed. The land was scarred. Cities lay in ruins. Families mourned. And millions of formerly enslaved people faced a terrifying question: what now? For the first time, black men could vote. They could hold office. They could dream of owning land, educating their children, and living as free citizens. It was more than freedom, it was hope. A fragile promise. Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts. Federal troops occupied the South. New constitutions were written. Rights were extended. For a brief moment, the nation seemed capable of justice. Black legislators entered offices, schools were established, and communities thrived. The world watched as America attempted a bold experiment in equality. But freedom had enemies. White resistance. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose in secret, using terror to control and intimidate. Churches and homes were burned. Families were beaten. Men were murdered. Fear replaced democracy in many regions. Northern resolve began to fade. The nation, exhausted by war and debt, grew impatient with Reconstruction. By 1877, federal troops withdrew. The South regained political control. The fragile dream of equality shattered almost overnight. Segregation and the color line. The post-Reconstruction South created laws that codified racial inequality. Jim Crow became the rule. Separate schools, separate churches, separate everything. Freedom had come, but not equality. Economic oppression replaced slavery. Sharecropping chained millions to poverty. Education was denied. Violence was constant. America had survived its greatest war, but it had failed to confront the deep injustice at its heart. Industrial America rises. Meanwhile, in the North and West, America was changing. Railroads spread across continents. Factories churned day and night. Immigration swelled cities with energy and culture. The nation's wealth grew, but so did inequality. Workers labored in dangerous conditions. Children worked long hours for pennies. Strikes were broken by police and military. Freedom for some created oppression for others. A nation tested again.
By 1900, America had survived civil war, rebellion, and Reconstruction. It had grown in territory, industry, and ambition, but the wounds of inequality festered quietly. Slavery was abolished, segregation remained, the promise of democracy was imperfectly fulfilled, and the next battles, economic, social, and moral, were just beginning. Forging Modern America, Industry and Inequality, 1870 to 1900. By the late 19th century, America was a land of contrasts. Skyscrapers rose where forests once stood. Trains connected oceans. Factories roared, powered by coal, steel, and ambition. The nation that had once survived bullets and cannon fire now thrived on iron and sweat. But the promise of wealth was not shared equally. Immigrants from Europe arrived by the millions. They came seeking opportunity, fleeing famine, persecution, and poverty. They were desperate, they were hopeful, and they were exploited. Cities of opportunity and misery. New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia swelled with humanity. Tenements were packed wall to wall. Children worked 12-hour days. Disease spread rapidly. Crime thrived. Yet the cities pulsed with energy. Theaters, newspapers, and political machines shaped daily life. Bosses like William Tweed controlled votes, police, and contracts. Democracy coexisted uneasily with corruption. Every alley held danger. Every factory floor held possibility. Captains of industry. Meanwhile, the rural landscape gave way to massive industrial empires. Men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and Cornelius Vanderbilt amassed fortunes unimaginable to most Americans. They built railroads, steel mills, and oil empires, but often at the cost of human lives. Workers died in accidents, wages were low, hours were long, strikes were crushed. Yet these men became symbols of success, their stories woven into the American dream. Labor fights back. Desperation bred resistance. Workers organized, unions formed. The Knights of Labor and American Federation of Labor demanded safety, fair pay, and dignity. Strikes erupted, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. At the Homestead strike, armed guards and Pinkertons clashed with steelworkers. Blood flowed, death occurred, but the fight for justice persisted. Labor battles defined the era as much as industrial triumphs. America learned that progress without protection is survival for the powerful, not the many. The immigrant experience. For newcomers, America was a land of contradictions. Freedom was promised. Poverty was real. Neighborhoods like Little Italy, Chinatown, and Jewish quarters thrived with culture, but also with struggle. Children learned English in school. Adults labored in sweatshops. Families endured prejudice. They navigated a society that celebrated opportunity, but punished difference. The United States was growing, but not necessarily welcoming. Seeds of reform. By 1900, the failures of unregulated capitalism were obvious. Child labor, dangerous factories, political corruption, and segregation demanded attention. A new generation of Americans would rise to confront these problems. Progressivism was on the horizon, a movement that would attempt to reconcile wealth, power, and justice in a rapidly changing nation. America had survived war, civil strife, and Reconstruction. Now it would be tested not by bullets, but by the challenges of modernity. The Progressive Promise, 1900 to 1920.
At the turn of the century, America was bursting at the seams. Cities teemed with people. Factories churned endlessly. Railroads, telegraphs, and telephones linked distant corners of the country. But wealth, opportunity, and justice were not evenly shared. The Progressive Era arose as a response. Reformers demanded change. Some sought to curb corporate power. Others pushed for labor rights. Women organized, children marched, and journalists exposed corruption in newspapers known as muckraking publications. Fighting for labor and fairness. Workers continued to suffer. Strikes and protests were common. In 1902, miners went on strike in Pennsylvania, demanding better wages and working conditions. Theodore Roosevelt, the president, intervened, a first in federal labor mediation. Progressive reformers realized that government could act as a mediator, but always with caution. Power, they learned, must be watched closely. Women demanded a voice. Women were increasingly vocal. For decades, they had argued for the vote. Leaders like Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had planted the seeds. Now younger activists carried the torch. In 1920, after relentless struggle, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women could vote. Their voices became part of the nation's political chorus. The color line remained. For African Americans, progress was painfully limited. Jim Crow laws entrenched racial segregation. Violence, intimidation, and disenfranchisement persisted in the South. Leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois called for education, political participation, and protest. The NAACP, founded in 1909, became a critical platform to challenge injustice. Even as America modernized, it remained a land of contradictions. Liberty celebrated, but equality withheld. Muckrakers and the public eye. Journalists like Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, and Lincoln Steffens exposed corporate greed, food adulteration, and political corruption. Their words ignited public outrage. Laws followed. Meat inspection, antitrust regulations, and labor protections slowly reshaped society. America was learning a lesson. Democracy requires constant vigilance. Freedom without accountability invites exploitation. Preparing for a global stage. By 1914, the world was on the brink of catastrophe. America had industrial might, growing influence, and a population ready for change. Yet it remained cautious. Isolationist sentiment prevailed. Many feared entanglement in European conflicts. And yet, history has a way of ignoring caution. The nation that had survived revolution, civil war, and industrial upheaval would soon face a global test, a war that would transform the United States and the world forever. The World at War and America Transformed, 1914 to 1920. In 1914, Europe exploded. Empires clashed, trenches carved landscapes, millions died. The world had never seen destruction on such a scale. At first, America watched. Isolationism ran deep. Woodrow Wilson urged neutrality. Yet the realities of global trade, submarine warfare, and political alliances pulled the nation closer. By 1917, America entered World War I. Young men left homes, farms, and factories for foreign shores. Soldiers faced mud, disease, and the horrors of modern weaponry. Poison gas, machine guns, and relentless artillery turned fields into nightmares. Victory and the home front. The war ended in 1918, but victory came at a tremendous cost. More than 100,000 American soldiers had died. Millions of others suffered injuries and trauma. At home, the Spanish flu pandemic claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Cities shut down.
Hospitals overflowed. Families grieved in silence. The dual impact of war and pandemic reshaped American society. Women had entered factories to fill roles left by soldiers. Their contributions strengthened the argument for suffrage. Immigrants and minorities also faced new opportunities, but also increased suspicion and racism. Social shifts and cultural tensions. The post-war era ignited profound social change. The Red Summer of 1919 revealed the persistence of racial violence as black communities faced riots in cities across the country. Labor unrest erupted as soldiers returned to industrial jobs, demanding fairer wages and safer conditions. Yet, hope and innovation flourished alongside tension. The Harlem Renaissance began to bloom in New York, celebrating African American culture, art, and literature. Jazz, poetry, and new ideas challenged old hierarchies, setting the stage for a vibrant, if conflicted, modern America. The seeds of modern America. By 1920, America had changed irreversibly. Women could vote, reshaping political landscapes. African American culture asserted itself despite systemic oppression. Urbanization, industry, and immigration created opportunities and inequalities. America had proven its military might and global influence. The country had survived revolution, civil war, industrial upheaval, and global war. Each crisis left scars, but also lessons. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered, racial, economic, and political, that would define the coming decades. America was no longer just a young republic. It was a modern nation, vibrant, conflicted, and full of contradictions. The Roaring Twenties: Jazz, Prohibition, and Change, 1920 to 1929. The 1920s arrived like an explosion. America celebrated. Soldiers returned from World War I, factories hummed, cities grew taller, faster, louder. The nation danced to a new rhythm, jazz. Speakeasies flourished. Alcohol, though illegal under Prohibition, flowed secretly through hidden doors and underground tunnels. Gangsters, fueled by greed and ambition, took control of the supply, creating criminal empires in Chicago, New York, and beyond. Names like Al Capone became synonymous with wealth, violence, and glamour. Cultural explosion. The era saw unprecedented cultural growth. The Harlem Renaissance brought writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston to prominence, giving voice to African American identity. Art, literature, and music challenged old norms, creating a new American culture that celebrated diversity, creativity, and bold expression. Women cut their hair, wore shorter skirts, and demanded independence. Flappers danced in speakeasies, embodying rebellion against Victorian traditions. Cities pulsed with nightlife, optimism, and the promise of freedom. Economic boom and unequal wealth. Factories roared, automobiles multiplied, and consumer culture soared. Cars, radios, and household appliances became symbols of modernity. Stock markets surged. The United States believed in endless prosperity. Yet wealth was unequal. Farmers struggled as crop prices fell. Industrial workers faced dangerous conditions despite union efforts. Rural areas and marginalized communities were often excluded from the era's promise. The boom was dazzling, but fragile. The shadow of Prohibition. Prohibition revealed a nation divided. Legally mandated morality clashed with human desire. Speakeasies flourished. Alcohol, though illegal under Prohibition, flowed secretly through hidden doors and underground tunnels. Gangsters, fueled by greed and ambition, took control of the supply, creating criminal empires in Chicago, New York, and beyond. Names like Al Capone became synonymous with wealth, violence, and glamour. The stage for collapse. By the end of the decade, the nation was confident, brash, and overextended. Credit fueled consumption, stock speculation soared, banks lent recklessly. The sense of invincibility was palpable. Few saw the warning signs. Few anticipated the coming collapse. And then, in 1929, it all began to unravel. The Great Depression was coming, a catastrophe that would test the United States as never before.
The Great Depression, Despair and Determination, 1929 to 1939. October 1929 shattered illusions. The stock market collapsed, billions vanished overnight, factories closed, banks failed. Millions of Americans lost their savings, homes, and livelihoods. Families wandered, searching for work. Children went hungry. Adults despaired. Cities and towns were filled with breadlines, shantytowns, and unemployment. The nation had been confident. It had believed in endless prosperity. Now it faced the harsh reality. Wealth can disappear, and society can fracture under stress. Hoover's limited response. President Herbert Hoover hesitated. He feared government intervention would weaken personal initiative. Relief programs were small, slow, and inadequate. Public frustration grew. The phrase Hoovervilles became common for shantytowns housing the homeless. Desperation became normalized, yet resilience quietly persisted. Communities supported one another. Farmers bartered goods. Families pooled resources. The American spirit, battered but unbroken, endured. Roosevelt and the New Deal. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt became president. He acted swiftly. The New Deal was launched. Federal jobs, public works projects, and social programs designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. The Civilian Corps Crew, CCC, planted forests. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, built roads, schools, and bridges. Social Security provided a safety net. Hope returned, but the scars of poverty, displacement, and hunger ran deep. Dust Bowl, nature's cruelty. Meanwhile, the Great Plains suffered. Over-farming, drought, and windstorms turned farmland to dust. Families fled. Tractors and barns were buried. Migrants headed west, carrying nothing but hope. John Steinbeck captured their plight in The Grape of Wrath, immortalizing the struggle of the displaced and the indomitable human spirit. America adapts. By the late 1930s, the nation had survived the Depression, but it had changed profoundly. Labor unions gained power. Government became more involved in daily life. The gap between the rich and poor, though still vast, was addressed more directly. Yet the world outside America's borders darkened. Dictators rose in Europe and Asia. Tensions brewed. America, weary from domestic struggle, would soon be called upon again, this time to face global conflict.
World War II. The United States goes to war. 1939 to 1945. By 1939, the world was on fire. Germany, Italy, and Japan expanded aggressively. Democracies trembled. Millions already suffered under occupation, persecution, and terror.
America initially remained neutral, trading goods but avoiding direct involvement. Yet neutrality was tested repeatedly. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, changed everything. The United States had no choice. The next day, Congress declared war. America was thrust into a global conflict on two fronts, Europe and the Pacific. Mobilizing a nation. The American economy shifted overnight. Factories that once produced cars now produced tanks, planes, and ships. Millions of men and women enlisted or were drafted. Women entered industrial jobs in unprecedented numbers, the iconic Rosy Riveter symbolizing their essential contribution. Rationing, war bonds, and civil defense shaped daily life. Children collected scrap metal. Citizens endured blackouts. Everyone contributed. The front lines. American soldiers faced brutal realities. In Europe, campaigns like D-Day tested courage and endurance. Beaches of Normandy became graves and symbols of liberation. In the Pacific, island-hopping campaigns exposed troops to disease, treacherous terrain, and fanatical enemies. African-American soldiers served valiantly despite segregation. Japanese Americans faced internment at home, stripped of freedom while fighting for the nation abroad. Victory demanded sacrifice on battlefields and home fronts alike. Holocaust and moral confrontation. As Allied troops advanced, the horrors of the Holocaust became undeniable. Millions of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and others had been murdered in systematic genocide. America confronted a moral imperative beyond military victory, the necessity of preserving human dignity against industrial evil. Victory at tremendous cost. By 1945, the war ended. Germany and Japan surrendered. Europe and Asia were devastated. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The United States emerged victorious, but transformed. It had become the preeminent global power. Its military might, industrial capacity, and scientific innovation, including the atomic bomb, reshaped geopolitics forever. The home front had also changed. Women who had worked in factories were pushed back into domestic roles, but their contribution forever altered expectations. African Americans demanded civil rights with renewed urgency. The nation had proven itself capable of greatness, but also of profound moral contradiction. The Cold War and a Divided World, 1945 to 1965. The guns of World War II fell silent, but a new battle began. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, each armed with unmatched military might and ideological ambition. Democracy versus communism, capitalism versus state control, freedom versus fear. Europe lay in ruins. Asia was in turmoil. The United Nations was formed to prevent future global catastrophe, but tensions persisted. The Cold War was a war of ideas, espionage, and proxy conflicts. It demanded vigilance without open battle on American soil, but its stakes were existential. Containment and global strategy. The United States implemented the policy of containment, aiming to stop communism from spreading. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe. NATO was formed. Military alliances strengthened America's global influence. Meanwhile, spies, secret missions, and nuclear weapons created a constant undercurrent of fear. Families practiced air raid drills, and the world lived under the shadow of mutually assured destruction. The fight for equality at home. The Cold War coincided with another revolution, this one in social conscience. African Americans had fought in World War II and returned determined to challenge inequality. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Thurgood Marshall emerged, demanding civil rights and justice. Landmark events, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Brown v. Board of Education decision, shattered legal segregation and inspired hope. Yet the struggle was relentless. Freedom and equality required courage in the face of violence and oppression. America explores its frontiers. Beyond civil rights and global diplomacy, America expanded its reach in science and technology. The space race began as the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. America responded with NASA, aiming to prove that freedom and innovation could triumph over authoritarian ambition. On July 20, 1969, humans walked on the moon. It was more than a scientific feat. It was a statement of ideals, ambition, and national identity. A nation transformed. By 1965, America was no longer simply a country recovering from war. It was a superpower, economically dominant, militarily potent, and culturally influential. Yet contradictions remained. Racial injustice persisted. Political divisions deepened. Global responsibilities multiplied. The promise of equality, prosperity, and freedom was still a work in progress. The nation had survived revolution, civil war, world wars, depression, and global ideological conflict. Each chapter left lessons, scars, and ambitions for the future. Turmoil and transformation. America in the 1960s and 1970s. The 1960s were a decade of contradictions. On one hand, the nation soared. Space exploration captured imaginations, and economic prosperity continued for many. On the other, America faced its deepest internal crises since the Civil War. The Vietnam War escalated. Young Americans were drafted to fight in a distant land, often under unclear objectives. Television brought the war into living rooms. Graphic images of death and destruction sparked outrage, protest, and division. The civil rights movement reached its peak. The struggle for equality intensified. African Americans marched, boycotted, and demanded justice. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. preached nonviolence, while others, frustrated by slow change, argued for more radical approaches. Key victories were won. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 legally ended segregation and protected voting rights. Yet social and economic inequalities persisted. Youth and cultural rebellion. College campuses and city streets became arenas for change. The counterculture challenged traditional values. Music, art, and fashion reflected rebellion. Anti-war protests swelled. Women demanded equality through the feminist movement, pushing for rights in education, work, and reproductive health. Society was shifting faster than politics could adjust. Generational tension intensified. Conservatism clashed with progressivism in homes, workplaces, and legislatures. Watergate and distrust. Political scandal further destabilized confidence in leadership. The Watergate scandal revealed corruption at the highest levels of government. President Richard Nixon resigned in 1974, the first in U.S. history. Americans questioned authority, truth, and the integrity of institutions. Trust had been fractured. The nation had to reconcile ideals with reality. Economic and global challenges. The oil crisis of 1973 and rising inflation tested the economy.
Global interdependence meant that events overseas, Middle Eastern conflicts, Cold War tensions, affected daily life. America was no longer isolated. Its influence was unmatched, yet its vulnerabilities were evident. The promise of progress was tempered by harsh lessons in humility and adaptation. The lessons of a tumultuous era. By the late 1970s, America had survived social upheaval, war, political scandal, and economic turbulence. The nation had expanded rights, challenged inequality, and adapted to global responsibilities. Yet the struggle for justice, equality, and unity remained ongoing. The story of America was never complete. Each generation inherited triumphs and failures, hope and scars.
The Reagan era and the end of the Cold War, 1980 to 1991. The 1980s arrived with ambition and tension. The Cold War still gripped the world, but America had grown in confidence. The economy rebounded from the struggles of the 1970s. Consumerism, technology, and culture flourished. Television and music shaped identity, and skyscrapers and malls symbolized prosperity. Ronald Reagan took office in 1981. He championed a vision of a strong America, tax cuts, deregulation, and military expansion. His rhetoric emphasized freedom, democracy, and anti-communism. Cold War confrontations. The Reagan administration escalated the arms race, increasing defense spending and deploying missiles in Europe. The world seemed on edge. Nuclear war felt possible. Yet, Reagan also engaged in diplomacy with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, culminating in agreements to reduce nuclear weapons. By 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. America emerged as the undisputed superpower. Democracy appeared triumphant over communism, capitalism over state control. Domestic transformation. Inside the United States, economic shifts reshaped communities. Manufacturing jobs declined. Technology and finance grew. The gap between wealthy and poor widened, creating new social and political tensions. Cultural identity evolved as well. Television, music, and film dominated daily life. Cable news brought global events into living rooms instantly. The nation celebrated success, but faced inequality, health crises like the AIDS epidemic, and debates over civil rights, women's equality, and immigration. America on the world stage. By the end of the decade, America projected unparalleled power, economic, military, and cultural. The Gulf War in 1991 demonstrated American military supremacy. Allied forces quickly defeated Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, showcasing technological and logistical prowess. Yet, global responsibility weighed heavily. The nation realized that dominance required not just strength, but diplomacy, wisdom, and ethical leadership. Reflections. The Reagan era and the end of the Cold War marked a turning point. America had survived wars, economic crises, civil strife, and social transformation. It had proven resilient and innovative. But the world had changed. New challenges, technology, terrorism, climate, and social inequality loomed on the horizon. The 20th century had been a crucible. The 21st century demanded adaptation, courage, and moral clarity. Modern America. Challenges, change, and continuity. 1991 to present. The Soviet Union fell. The Cold War ended. America stood as the sole superpower, economically dominant, militarily unmatched, and culturally influential. The 1990s brought optimism, technological revolution, and globalization. The Internet connected millions. Silicon Valley reshaped business and communication. Yet even prosperity had contradictions. Inequality persisted. Political polarization grew. Social debates over race, gender, immigration, and civil liberties intensified. Terror and war. September 11, 2001 changed everything. Terrorists attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Thousands died. Fear spread across the nation. America responded by launching the War on Terror, including wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The conflicts tested national resolve, strained resources, and sparked global debate. Security became paramount, but so did the question of liberty. How to protect citizens without compromising freedom. Social, cultural, and technological transformation. The 21st century saw rapid innovation. Smartphones, social media, and global connectivity transformed communication, politics, and culture. Movements for racial justice, gender equality, and climate action gained momentum. Americans debated, protested, and innovated, proving that democracy is never static. It is a living process. Reflections on a nation's journey. From the first colonies to independence, from civil war to global superpower, the United States has survived extraordinary trials. Revolution and nation-building, civil war and Reconstruction, industrialization and inequality, world wars and the Cold War, terrorism and technological upheaval. The story of America is one of resilience, innovation, moral struggle, and endless ambition. Its past is filled with contradictions, freedom and oppression, wealth and poverty, courage and fear. Yet, through triumphs and failures, the nation continues to adapt. Each generation inherits both the promise and the burdens of liberty. Each citizen contributes to the ongoing experiment that is the United States. History shows that freedom is fragile, justice is never guaranteed, and progress demands vigilance. But it also shows that determination, courage, and hope can shape a nation beyond imagination. America is still writing its story, and every chapter reminds the world that the struggle for liberty and justice is ongoing, complex, and profoundly human.